30,000 men, 30 years undefeated. In 1575, Katsuyori led the greatest cavalry force Japan had ever built in one final charge, and Nobunaga just waited. What happened in the next 60 seconds destroyed an army and a legend. For 30 years, no army in Japan could stop them. One sight on the battlefield, the Takeda Diamond Crest closing at full gallop, and disciplined men broke and ran. What made the Takeda Cavalry so terrifying? And what finally destroyed them?
The foundation was geography. Kai Province, modern Yamanashi, is a landlocked mountain basin surrounded by the Japanese Alps on 3 sides. It had no access to the sea, no major rice plains, and limited natural wealth. What it had was horses. The Kai horse, bred in the mountain grasslands of the Koma region, was not the largest animal in Japan, but it was extraordinarily tough. It could operate at altitude, carry heavy loads over rough terrain, and sustain long marches that would exhaust animals bred in the lowlands. Shingen understood that this was not a limitation, it was a weapon.
The Kai horse was central to Shingen's military thinking. But the cavalry he built was not simply a matter of mounting soldiers on horses. It was a complete doctrine. Takeda cavalry trained for coordinated shock, a massed charge delivered at the right moment to break an enemy formation that had already been softened by infantry pressure and missile fire. The horses were trained to move together, to hold formation at speed, and to respond to drum signals across the chaos of battle. Shingen did not invent Japanese cavalry. He industrialized it, standardized the training, the equipment, the command structure, and built it into the decisive arm of a full military system.
The cavalry was only as good as the men who led it. Shingen's genius lay not only in strategy, but in his ability to identify and develop commanders of exceptional talent. Chief among them was Yamagata Masakage, commander of the Red Fire Brigade, whose men wore entirely crimson-lacquered armor to make them visible and terrifying on the battlefield. There was Baba Nobuharu, a general said to have fought in hundreds of engagements without receiving a single wound, a record that made him legendary even among his contemporaries. And Naito Masatoyo, whose cavalry unit was perhaps the most technically refined force Shingen commanded. These men were not simply soldiers, they were weapons in human form.
The tactical philosophy that governed the cavalry was embedded in the Furin Kazan, the 4-part maxim taken from Sun Tzu that Shingen adopted as the Takeda standard. Swift as wind, the cavalry was the instrument of sudden movement and rapid repositioning. Silent as forest, it could be held in reserve, concealed, until the precise moment to strike. Fierce as fire, when the charge came, it came with total commitment, nothing held back. Immovable as mountain. When defending or holding, the formation locked and did not yield. The cavalry was specifically the embodiment of the first and third principles: speed and fire, controlled, then unleashed. The proving ground was Kawanakajima, the 5 battle series fought against Uesugi Kenshin between 1553 and 1564 in the flat delta where the Chikuma and Saigawa rivers meet in Shinano province. The fourth battle, in 1561, was the most savage. Kenshin crossed the river at night and struck directly at Shingen's main camp. The cavalry was crucial in absorbing and then repelling the assault. What Kawanakajima demonstrated was not that Takeda cavalry was invincible. It wasn't. But that it was versatile. It could charge, it could countercharge, it could screen a retreat, and it could hold ground when dismounted. Against the best general in Japan, the cavalry kept the Takeda army together.
The cavalry's greatest single performance came at Miketagahara in January 1573. Tokugawa Ieyasu, who had 11,000 men to Shingen's 30,000, made the fatal decision to leave Hamamatsu Castle and face the Takeda in open terrain. Shingen let him form up, then unleashed the cavalry in a coordinated envelopment. The Takeda cavalry did not charge frontally. It attacked the flanks simultaneously, cutting into the Tokugawa formations from two sides at once. Within hours, Ieyasu's army ceased to exist as a fighting force. Ieyasu himself barely escaped. What made the Takeda cavalry terrifying was not just its speed. It was the knowledge, shared by every commander in Japan, that if it caught you in the open, there was no answer. The reputation, built over 30 decades, was almost as powerful as the cavalry itself. By the early 1570s, Takeda cavalry had become a symbol, a psychological weapon that operated before the first horse moved. Commanders who knew they were facing the Takeda adjusted their entire strategy to avoid being caught in open ground. Because being caught in open ground by Takeda cavalry was understood to be fatal. Nobunaga fortified positions. Ieyasu garrisoned castles and avoided engagement. Even Kenshin, the one general who consistently matched Shingen tactically, chose terrain that limited cavalry effectiveness at Kawanakajima. The cavalry had changed, not just how battles were fought, but how wars were planned. And then Shingen died.
Takeda Katsuyori was 29 when he inherited command of the clan in 1573. He was not without ability. He had led cavalry in battle under his father, and at Takatenjin Castle in 1574, he demonstrated genuine tactical skill, forcing a castle to surrender after a siege that embarrassed Nobunaga. But the summer of 1575 changed everything. Nobunaga had spent the 2 years since Shingen's death preparing for exactly the moment he now faced. He had assembled 38,000 men. He had positioned thousands of arquebusiers behind a system of wooden palisades along the Rengogawa River near Nagashino Castle. And he had invited Katsuyori to come to him.
The Takeda cavalry had never faced a prepared defensive position of this kind. Several of Katsuyori's most experienced generals, men who had served under Shingen, advised against a frontal assault. The palisades were constructed to channel and slow a cavalry charge. The arquebusiers behind them were specifically positioned to fire through gaps. Baba Nobuharu, who had never taken a wound in decades of campaigning, reportedly told Katsuyori directly that the attack should not be made. The advice was rejected. Katsuyori believed, perhaps correctly in a narrow tactical sense, that the Takeda cavalry could overwhelm any defensive line if it hit hard enough. He was
was 3 years out of date. On June 28, 1575, the Takeda Cavalry charged. The arquebusiers behind the palisade held their fire until the horses were close, and then fired in sustained, coordinated volleys. The traditional account describes 3 rotating ranks of shooters. As the first rank fired and reloaded, the second rank stepped forward and fired, then the third. The effect was a near continuous wall of fire that the cavalry, committed to its charge across open ground with no cover, rode directly into. The horses that were not hit veered or fell. The men who reached the palisade found it too solid to break. What had been unstoppable in open terrain was against a prepared position with disciplined firepower stopped.
The generals died one after another. Yamagata Masakage, commander of the Red Cavalry, who had never lost a battle, fell in the charge. Maito Masatoyo fell. Sanada Nobutsuna and his brother Masateru fell. Tsuchiya Masatsugo fell. By the end of the day, 6 of the Takeda's most experienced battlefield commanders were dead. Baba Nobuharu, the general who had argued against the attack, the man who had never taken a wound, died in the rearguard action, holding the line to allow Katsuyori and the remnants of the army to retreat. He fell, covering the escape of a commander whose decision he had opposed. It was a final, characteristic act, a soldier's death in service of a cause he knew was already lost.
The Takeda clan did not die at Nagashino, but the cavalry did. The force that had taken 30 years to build, the horses, the training systems, the network of commanders who understood the doctrine, was gone in a single afternoon. Katsuyori survived, but he survived without the instrument that had made the Takeda name feared across Japan. He would spend the next 7 years trying to maintain a domain that could no longer defend itself in the field. When Nobunaga finally launched his annihilation campaign in 1582, the Takeda collapsed within weeks. Not because their castles were weak, but because the army that had protected those castles, the cavalry that had kept every enemy at a distance for a generation, no longer existed.
Modern historians have complicated the picture considerably. The traditional account of Nagashino, 3 ranks of arquebusiers rotating in disciplined volleys, a revolutionary new tactic that made cavalry obsolete, has been challenged on multiple grounds. Some researchers argue there is no contemporary evidence for the rotating volley formation. The detailed description appears in documents written generations later. Others note that the arquebus had been in widespread use in Japanese warfare long before 1575, and that the Takeda cavalry had faced firearms in previous engagements without catastrophic results. What made Nagashino different, these historians argue, was not a tactical innovation, but numbers. Nobunaga simply had more arquebusiers, better prepared positions, and a commander on the other side who refused to adapt.
There is also the deeper question of what the Takeda cavalry actually was. The image fixed in later popular culture, hundreds of heavily armored samurai thundering across the battlefield on powerful war horses, overstates the reality. The Kai horse was a relatively small animal. Many samurai may have used horses primarily for transport,
dismounting to fight on foot. The cavalry charge as a primary shock tactic was one element of the Takeda system, not the whole of it. What distinguished the Takeda militarily was the combination: coordinated infantry, mobile cavalry, skilled commanders, and above all, the strategic intelligence of Shingen himself. The cavalry was the visible edge. The machine behind it was what made the edge sharp.
The question that haunts Nagashino is what Shingen would have done. The veterans who advised against the attack knew the answer. Shingen had never committed cavalry to a prepared defensive position on terms set by the defender. At Kawanakajima, at Mikatagahara, at every significant battle in his career, he had chosen the ground or forced the enemy to abandon advantageous terrain before attacking. Patience was his most consistent weapon. He had waited 30 years for the right moment. Katsuyori waited 3 months before Nagashino, before deciding he couldn't wait any longer. The cavalry that had survived because Shingen chose when to use it was destroyed because Katsuyori felt he had to use it. Timing. It was always about timing.
The legacy of the Takeda cavalry was felt most powerfully in what it forced Nobunaga to build. The threat of cavalry, real or imagined, drove the development of defensive infantry tactics, fortified camp design, and the mass deployment of arquebusiers throughout the 1560s and 1570s. Nobunaga's genius at Nagashino was not the rotating volley, whatever its historical accuracy. It was the recognition that the cavalry's psychological power could be broken if men stood their ground long enough. His fortified line was as much a psychological barrier as a physical one. He bet that his arquebusiers, protected by palisades, would not break and run. They didn't. And in not breaking, they broke the cavalry's most important weapon, the certainty that it could not be stopped. The Nagashino battlefield today is a quiet area of central Aichi Prefecture. Farmland, a small museum, a monument. Every year it draws historians, enthusiasts, and descendants of the men who fought there. The palisade is reconstructed in part. The Rengogawa River still runs past the field. What is harder to reconstruct is the terror of what the Takeda cavalry once was. The speed, the drumming of hooves on mountain soil, the sight of crimson lacquered armor closing at a gallop across ground where no army had successfully stood against it. For 30 years, it was the most feared force in Japan. Its end was also one of history's most consequential military lessons. That even the most feared weapon fails when the conditions that made it effective no longer exist.
Next time on Samurai Chronicles, he was the man who created the shogunate. He won every war he fought. And then he hunted down the brother who had won those wars for him. The jealousy that built Japan's first military government. Coming next. The Takeda Cavalry. Built on mountain horses and 30 years of tactical refinement, feared across Japan. Destroyed in a single afternoon at Nagashino in 1575 by a combination of palisades, arquebuses, and a commander who had no answer for any of them. The legend that survived that afternoon was, in many ways, more powerful than the cavalry itself. It shaped how the Japanese imagined samurai warfare for centuries to come. The diamond crests, the red armor, the charge across the plain. The reality was more complicated, more human, and more tragic. A weapon that had always depended on the genius of one man to know when not to use it, passed to a man who used it too soon. And a legend was born from its destruction. And for our own land, here is a story of one who was afraid to fight, and yet lived to become a hero. Please join us as we travel back to Shogun Japan.